Hey, welcome back. So we've been able to perform some very basic programming operations up to this point, but to do truly useful and interesting things, we're going to need to take advantage of more of Python's built-in functionality. What functionality, you say? Well, functions. So in case you were wondering, in Python and programming languages in general, a function is just a named chunk of code that we can invoke on demand that performs some specific task. In kind of the same way that your phone has a camera function that allows it to take pictures, or an email function that allows you to send emails. But in addition to performing tasks, functions can also return values, as we'll see in a moment. So to invoke, or call, a function in code, all we need to do is type the name of the function followed by a pair of parentheses. Now some functions, but not all, will also need for us to supply one or more pieces of information to them that are then used by the function to generate its output. These pieces of information are called arguments, and we pass them to the function by typing them in between the parentheses after the function name, separated by commas. Then, when we run the code, whatever function that function performs will be executed. This functionality, okay, I'll stop with the function puns, can range from relatively mundane actions to some seriously impressive stuff. We'll see plenty of examples of the latter a bit later on when we start tackling automation tasks. So switching back over to Replit, let's take a look at a few examples of using Python functions. So as has become usual at this point, to get started coding in Python in the shell, I'll type Python and then hit enter. And now for our first example, let's say that you want to find out what data type a certain value is. So Python has a built-in function called type that can help out with this. All you have to do is pass in the value you want to check, and the type function will return the data type of that piece of data. So I'll go ahead and type 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And sure enough, Python tells us that that value has a data type of int. Specifically, it tells us it is of the class int, and that word class does have special meaning in Python, but we won't worry about that just yet. Also note that I didn't have to type the print function like I have up to this point. That's because if the code you enter here in the shell returns a value, when you run that code, the value that's returned when your code executes will automatically be displayed here in the shell. So now for our second example here, I'll again use the type function, but now I'll check the type of the text string hello world. And sure enough, this time we get a data type, or class, of string. Now one thing I want to point out here is the difference between a function like type that returns a value and a function like print that performs an action. In general, functions in Python are broadly divided into those two categories. Functions that do things, like print text to the Python shell, and functions that return values, like the type function returning the data type of whatever input we pass in between its parentheses. Now at this point, you might be wondering if you can create your own functions in Python. The answer is yes, you absolutely can. But Python has so many useful functions built right in that you can go far without rolling your own. So for now, we're going to focus on those built-in functions. Okay, so now we've used the type function to determine the type of a piece of data. But what if we want to convert a value from one data type to another? Well, Python has functions for that too. For example, let's say we have a decimal number, or in Python speak, a floating point number, but we want to convert that number to an integer. We can use Python's built-in int function to do this. So for our example value, I'll use the number 123.45. And to remind ourselves what the data type of that value is, I'll pass it in to the type function as an argument. And sure enough, we see it's a float. But now let's see what happens if we pass that same value into the int function as its argument. Look at that. Our return value is simply 123, which is the integer component of that floating point decimal that we passed into the int function. So the int function was able to convert that decimal number, that floating point number, into an integer. And just to prove this to you, I'm going to take this int function that we just typed on the shell and pass it as an argument to the type function. So I'll start by typing type, and then an open parenthesis. And now, instead of passing a value into the type function as its argument, I'll pass in our other function, the int function. And then to that int function, I'll pass in our floating point number. Then I'll close the parenthesis for our int function, and then the parenthesis for our type function. Now this works because our int function is going to return a value that is then passed to the type function. So now running this, sure enough, the data type of the value that was returned by the int function is, of course, an int. Now this last line of code here, in which we passed one function to another function as its argument, is an example of nesting functions, which means using the output of one function as the input, or more specifically an argument, to another function. And again, in this example, the output of the int function is being passed to the type function as its argument. Now this kind of nesting is quite common in the wild, since it's a convenient way to execute a series of actions or transformations on a piece of data. And we can actually nest as many functions inside of other functions as we want, but I would caution you that it's best to not go too crazy with nesting just for the sake of the readability of your code. Okay, switching back to the topic of converting the data types of values in Python with built-in functions, let's see how we can use another function to convert an integer or even a string to a decimal / floating point number. Now we can do this with Python's built-in float function. So let's type float, and then inside of the parentheses after that function name, we'll pass the integer 1, 2, 3. And then closing that parenthesis and hitting enter. Our value is still technically 123, but now there's a .0 at the end, signifying that the data type of that value is now float. And just to prove that to you once again, let's take that float function and pass it to the type function just to verify the data type that's being returned. So we'll say type, and then float, 123, and then we'll close that out with 2 parentheses. And once again, we see that that function has successfully converted the data type of the value that we passed to it. Now keep in mind that these type conversion functions only work when the data you're trying to convert is actually compatible with the data type you're trying to convert it to. For example, let's see what happens if I try to convert the string howdy earth to int. Predictably, Python gets upset since there's just no scenario in which that text string could be interpreted as a number. However, if I just change that input string to a series of numeric characters, so I'll just say int 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, now the int function works just fine. So as our last example, let's take a look at Python's string function, which is actually spelled / abbreviated str. So this stir function, which converts inputs to strings, is a bit more generous than int or float, since basically any sequence of characters can be treated as a string. For example, I can easily convert the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to a string that consists of the characters 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So let's try that. So I'll say str, and then in between those parentheses, I'll just type 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And those single quotes we see flanking the return value that we got from our stir function are a dead giveaway that its return value is of a string data type. But once again, just to prove that, let's get some help from our type function. And sure enough, the return value is a certified string. Now I know the difference between the string 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seems pretty subtle, but Python is very aware of the difference behind the scenes, and that difference very much informs the kinds of operations we can perform on those respective values, as we'll see coming up. Now it's worth noting that the type conversion functions we just reviewed, int, float, and stir, aren't all of the type conversion functions that Python has to offer. They're just 3 of the most common. To see a comprehensive list, as with pretty much anything else you might need to look up, but definitely don't need to memorize, I would strongly encourage you to refer to Python's documentation. Okay. Up next, we'll see how to transcend the boundaries of Python's built-in functions by using Python to create expressions, which will allow us to perform our own custom operations on data. I'll see you then.